Why are we still gripping plastic controllers in a world where our own hands can do the job? Controllers have delivered pinpoint accuracy and familiar ergonomics for years. Hand tracking promises a more natural experience by mapping your fingers and your palm directly into VR. Gloves do this even more accurately and naturally with haptic feedback. However, each approach comes with its own quirks. Latency, occlusion, bulk, cost, setup, these are all factors that we need to consider if we want to use them. But before we just compare the pros and cons, I think it's time we do a little research. And at the end of this video, we'll find out what the perfect controller really is. If there even is one. First, controllers. Here's a brief history of input devices. Arguably the first ever video game, Space War was a space combat game developed in the 1960s on a PDP-1, which kinda looks like a radar screen. Ships were controlled with 4 of the 8 test word switches on the PDP-1, which looked a little something like this. Players had just 4 controls each. You can rotate counterclockwise, clockwise, turn your rocket thrust on, and fire a torpedo. Players tried to eliminate each other by firing torpedoes and maneuvering their ships. This was the first of many firsts within video games and controllers, so naturally it came about with a plethora of issues. One player always had the advantage since the screen of the PDP-1 was to one side of the switches, the table where the switches stood was at a weird height, so players' elbows got tired easily, and having 4 switches lined up next to each other with no labels, mind you, meant players had to memorize what each of the switches did. This isn't like modern video games where you can tell the program what you want each key press to do, so instead of 8 switches lined up, they designed a control box with 2 switches. One controls rotation and the other controls the rocket accelerator, and a single button to fire a torpedo. This resulted in the creation of a custom-made control box for Space War, giving birth to the first ever proper video game controllers. Several other designs for this came about, including one that included singular buttons for all 5 functions. These were the first generation of button-based controllers. Fast forward to the Atari 2600 released in 1977, it became the first widely used cross-platform controller with a joystick. But now we're in 2025. There's now hundreds, if not thousands, of choices out there for controllers, especially third-party ones which have had a bit of a boost lately in popularity as people want more customization. This finally leads me back to virtual reality. Ever since the Oculus Rift, we still use the same design for pretty much everything. One trigger, one grip button, one joystick, 2 buttons, and a system button at the very least. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with standardization. There's a reason why most keyboards look that way and why USB Type-C is slowly taking over. Thanks to you. Is there a better controller though? Is this really the best we can do for VR? So I did some more research. A lot of research. It took a month. To sum most of it up, let's take a quick look at how controllers and headsets work. Headsets and controllers are tracked in 2 ways, both using infrared lights and infrared cameras, plus gyroscopes and accelerometers to track orientation. The first way is considered rather primitive by 5th generation headsets. Base stations, or lighthouses if you're still running an Oculus Rift in 2025, you have my full respect, are placed within a room on opposite sides, usually in a pair or a pair of 2. To track the headset and controllers. This is also called outside-in tracking. The second way is what most people are familiar with, inside-out. The IR cameras are already embedded within the headset, which removes the need for stationary base stations. This does 2 things. Track the headset's position dynamically with onboard cameras while also tracking its own controller's position with the same cameras. This is why headsets have gotten much cheaper and more accessible to the public. You don't need an entire dedicated room just to use VR. Both approaches, though, come with their own pros and cons. Base stations provide precision to the millimeter, have wide FOV coverage with very minimal occlusion issues, very low latency, and tracks everything independently. However, it's much less portable, costs a lot more, and needs an unobstructed view of both your headset and controllers. Not to mention the external setup. Some examples of controllers that do this are the Rift CV1 controllers and the Valve Index controllers, and before you say, what about the Vive ones? I'm not gonna touch up on the controller only a mother could love. Its only use in the big 2025 is to be a weapon that you beat the ever-living shit out of your neighbor who's doing construction at 6 in the morning. I'm looking at you, Steve. Inside-out tracking doesn't need external sensors. It's much cheaper, makes sense for more casual users, and works pretty well for anything not involving motion capture of your entire body. On the other hand, it's much less precise. Your controllers only track when they're visible to the cameras, meaning that you can't put your hand behind your back or do anything really with your hands if your own headset can't see the controllers. You see how it's lagging behind? Now I put it in front of my camera, now it sees it. It's also very dependent on lighting and environment, unlike base stations that work regardless if you have the lights on or not. And everything is tracked all on board the headset, which means more computing power and battery allocated to just tracking. But that's not really an issue on current-gen headsets. There's a few more tracking solutions, namely hybrid tracking, optical marker and markerless tracking, magnetic tracking, and even ultra-wideband tracking, which is a really good topic for a future video, but I'm getting ahead of myself. This leads me to the alternative to controllers, hand tracking. And gloves, but we'll get to that. Hand tracking itself is a niche within a niche, and for good reason. Only a few headsets support native hand tracking, namely the Quest 2, Quest 3 and 3S, HTC's Vive Focus 3 and XR Elite, the Pico 4 and 4 Ultra, and more recently the PSVR 2. How that works, I have no goddamn idea. More expensive enterprise headsets that were created with hand tracking in mind are the HoloLens 2 and the Vario XR3/VR3 and XR4 headsets. I know, it's a mouthful. You might be asking why I haven't even mentioned the Apple Vision Pro yet, and here's the thing. Everything I've mentioned so far, even the HoloLens and Vario headsets, are natively able to use 6 degrees of freedom motion controllers. The AVP can only use hand tracking. There's an asterisk there, I'll get to that later. It's worth mentioning that there's a few more enhanced hand tracking methods out there. Ultraleap, for instance, basically spearheaded early hand tracking tech and is still used today in headsets like the Vario. They even made a little sensor thing called Gemini that can attach on basically any headset to give it hand tracking. No, the other one. There we go. The Quest 3S and Apple Vision Pro use a technique similar to Ultraleap, where IR illuminators brighten up whatever's in front of you, probably your hands, which enhance contrast, improve depth, and preserve tracking in low light conditions, all without having dedicated depth sensors. Except the AVP, which just has to be different and has a LiDAR scanner. Guess what, that's what $3,000 gets you. I get it, you're an Apple product, whatever. Back to what I was saying. It's a niche within a niche. There are roughly 10,000-ish games and apps on the MetaQuest store, and again, these are rough estimates, but only a few hundred actually support hand tracking from the ground up. And popular titles only boil down to a few dozen, like Cubism, Hand Physics Lab, and Rogue Ascent. These are mostly experimental puzzle-based tech demo-y games. Virtual Desktop's finger tracking is nice to have, but I would just rather wake my controller up for a few seconds before putting it down again to just not deal with trying to be precise with a very imprecise sensor. It's like trying to do surgery while someone keeps shaking the operating table. It's annoying. Look, the biggest factor really limiting hand tracking right now is just hardware, and luckily as VR advances pretty much every year, you'll see headsets and accessories getting cheaper and better as time goes by. But you can say that literally about everything in VR right now. That aside, let's talk about gloves. Gloves are, for lack of a better term, in a weird space, right now at least. It's extremely beneficial to people who need precision and simulation first and foremost. Think engineers, architects, and doctors who get their training in VR, but makes absolutely no sense to probably 90% of people. Most gloves, at least those that don't get you arrested at the airport, cost minimum $300 and upwards of $5,000. And a lot of them are pretty bulky and heavy, not to mention not everyone's hands are the same size. Almost no mainstream VR titles support glove-only input. Every game, at least those that people actually play, depend on joysticks for locomotion, physical buttons, triggers, and grips for input, and at the very least, a single menu button for system control. These developers don't really have a rhyme or reason to add support for such a niche user base, and this has sort of a parry effect back to consumers where with barely any application at all, gloves lose even more appeal. Haptics are another issue. Most gloves only have vibration as feedback, which is largely insufficient, as it struggles to deliver realistic sensations like hardness, shape, or resistance, or forgot what this is called. But it's still largely better than nothing, as on hand tracking you get none of that. So largely any vibration is better than nothing. But some gloves actually have really interesting way of doing haptics. See, there are two main types of haptic sensors that most gloves use. First is motor haptics, which is probably what you're used to. It's what you have in your regular old controllers and phones, which have tiny motors that provide vibration and resistance. These are usually pretty simple and cheap to make. Fluid haptics, on the other hand, is a whole different world. See these backpacks these guys are wearing alongside their gloves? Contrary to popular belief, these aren't backpack PCs. These actually supply haptics to the gloves. They use contact pumps with reservoirs, usually filled with either air or liquid, which has a tube network connected to the gloves. The pump pressurizes the fluid, or air, valves direct flow to specific glove chambers, think individual fingers or your palm, and these chambers inflate or deflate to apply pressure or resistance. These can also provide texture by rapid micropressure variations and impact through sudden bursts. These are really helpful for people who work in high-risk environments where they can feel accurate physical feedback without any danger, or even for robots that can be controlled remotely to take care of things like hazardous materials, do surgery, or even defuse bombs. These, however, are quite costly, which makes sense, but they're also pretty bulky because, well, you need the backpack or a waist mount to store the pumps, and not to mention that they're a little slower than haptic motors, as the pump needs to pump and the valves need to valve, which takes time. There's also these other haptic types like electro-osmotic pump arrays, did I say that right? Electro-tactile haptics, and thermal haptics, but we don't have enough time for that right now, so let's move on. Okay, so lastly, tracking. Remember how I talked about controller tracking earlier? They work in the same way, just different solutions. The haptX gloves, for example, use base stations and IMUs for position and magnetic tracking for fingertips, but these are quite old, so it's not really that relevant. The Manus Prime is much sleeker, but it still uses those same base stations for tracking. The UDCap is even sleeker, claimed to be just 45 grams, but it still uses base stations. I could go on. But point is, almost every glove right now uses base stations for tracking, and the only ones that I know of at least are the Senso glove and 11D glove, which both use IMUs. However, IMU only tracking suffers from drift and lacks absolute position accuracy over larger spaces. Just ask someone that uses IMU-based full body trackers, they are a pain. And DIY gloves that I mentioned earlier are almost always paired with a tracker or a controller just to know its position. So this leads me back to those Apple Vision Pro controllers I mentioned. Since the AVP doesn't have any onboard cameras dedicated to tracking controllers, the Surreal Touch controllers have two fisheye cameras with its onboard hardware running SLAM-based localization, so they track their own position and orientation independently of external sensors, which is much better than strapping a Tundra tracker on a glove. However, of course there has to be a catch. The tracking claims to have sub 10mm positional error and sub 1° orientation error at 100Hz. In English that means very accurate. In practice though, many users complain about the tracking glitching when movement is fast, or even just cutting out entirely for upwards of 20 seconds at a time. So it really depends on if you're doing something that requires a lot of fast movement. Here's another thing, it doesn't work standalone on the Apple Vision Pro, which kind of makes sense as the AVP wasn't built for controller input anyway. It connects to a PC via the Surreal Link app and uses ALVR to stream SteamVR back to the Vision Pro, much like Virtual Desktop, which then recognizes the controllers as OVR input. So generally they're okay for simple stuff, but as you do more complex and fast movements, they generally get worse to use as time goes on. I have to mention this since we are talking about the Apple Vision Pro, but Apple seems to be working on adding official support for the PSVR 2 Sense controllers that you can see in the Vision OS 26 beta, which should fix most of the Surreal controllers problems, but I digress. I mainly brought the Surreal controllers up as it brings a really good idea. Just executed poorly. The Quest Pro, on the other hand, actually uses the same solution, just a lot better, even in fast movement with very low tracking accuracy error and so far quite reliable with some overheating issues and the worst performance in low light conditions and a lot of input and latency bugs notwithstanding. Okay, just ignore that. Okay, it's new tech. It's new tech. Okay, give them some time to figure it out. Give them some time, okay? Alright, I think I've talked about pretty much every relevant controller in existence, so I think it's only time that I tell you what the perfect VR controller really is. Drumroll please. Oh god fucking damn. Okay, so it kind of doesn't exist, but we have come quite close with the index controllers. If the thousands of RMA requests don't tell you that people love this thing, I don't know what to tell you. There's not much I can say about the index controllers, I'll be honest with you. They're just really nice, and everything just works, and it just works well. But they still fucking use base stations. Since we're talking about the index anyway, from what we know from leaks at least, this is what the Deckard EVT controllers, nicknamed Roy, looks like. And I know what you're thinking. Isn't that just a Quest 3 controller with a D-pad? Well, actually no. The Deckard, allegedly, has a trigger and a bumper, and this mockup from Reddit shows possibly even 2 grip buttons on both controllers, and that it may even put the Steam Deck's touchpads on the controller. None of these are confirmed of course, but from these leaks alone, which show the controls as kind of a hybrid of Quest and Xbox controllers, shows that Valve might be trying to move the industry towards the best of both worlds. And if we've learned anything from the Index and Steam Deck's release, we know that Valve has some pretty good power with swaying the industry in a specific way, so we'll see. As a runner-up, the MetaQuest Touch Pro is arguably side by side with the Index, which offers its compelling self-tracked motion and advanced haptics. However, it gets a lot of marks down for the issues with firmware updates breaking everything, overheating, tracking being fragile, and it relying on Wi-Fi to send tracking data to the headset, not Bluetooth mind you, Wi-Fi, can make it have a lot of interference with other Wi-Fi sources or messed up router settings. Okay, we don't live in a perfect world. If we did, then Twitter wouldn't exist. A lot of people don't get that we are still technically in the very early stages of this tech. To put that into perspective, only around 100 million people across both AR and VR actually have this hardware, which is tiny compared to the billions of people using smartphones and laptops. Even though the enthusiasm around this stuff peaked during the COVID times, a lot of the market is still quite nascent, unlike what smartphones achieved very long ago. The industry is maturing rapidly, but we have to remember that the average Quest 3 user just plays 2 or 3 games for maybe an hour before putting the headset down and going about their lives. They don't care if their controllers are tracked by the headset or the controllers itself, they just use it. And especially for developers, there is still very little return on investment as these things take a lot of time and money. Especially money. XR for enterprise and industrial stuff is growing, but there's still not that much VR can do that incentivizes them to invest in advanced stuff that they can just do with some more manpower. If there's one thing that you can take away from this video, it's that we are still in a very early adopter phase. Maybe not as early as the Oculus Rift anymore, but we are still early. There is no such thing as a perfect controller. Yet, hand tracking is still far from ideal in most cases, and gloves are still kind of meh in terms of usability for most people. But these methods of input have their own unique uses. Hand tracking is great for casual stuff like watching movies, working with VR as your display, and social VR. Gloves are amazing for people that really need them to do their work in XR, and controllers are the best of both worlds. There may not be a perfect controller or a perfect glove yet, but at least we can rest easy knowing that we've killed the Vive wand. Thank you so much for watching. I realized I haven't even introduced myself. I'm Allison, and this whole thing is Versec. This video may have taken a month to make, but it took me almost 4 years just to put one out. I've done so much to make this whole project possible, and what you're seeing right now is just the beginning. I hope you'll enjoy whatever I put out next, and if you appreciate my work, consider supporting me on Ko-Fi. Like, subscribe, tell your mom you love her, do whatever you want.